In September 1581, a court in Bavaria sentenced a man to exactly 42 strikes with the wheel. Not 40, not 45, 42. That specific number was written into official legal documents because the judges wanted to be absolutely precise about how much suffering this man deserved. The man was Peter Niers, and depending on which document you read, he had either murdered 75 people or 544 people. That gap, 469 additional murders supposedly committed in just 4 years, tells you almost everything you need to know about what was really happening in 16th century Germany. Because Niers wasn't just a criminal, he became something far more dangerous, a legend, and once someone becomes a legend, the truth stops mattering. What happened to Peter Niers over 3 days in Neumarkt in der Oberpfalz, a town about 40 kilometers southeast of Nuremberg, represents one of the most methodical, documented and deliberately prolonged executions in European history. Day 1. Strips of flesh torn from his entire body with heated pincers, then hot oil poured into every wound. Day 2. His feet coated in oil and roasted over burning coals. Day 3. That wheel, those 42 precise strikes, each one calculated to shatter bone without immediately killing him. But here's what makes this story genuinely unsettling. We know what they did to him. What we don't actually know is what he did. To understand Peter Niers, you first have to understand what Germany looked like in the 1570s. Because this wasn't the Germany you might picture. Orderly, bureaucratic, precise. This was a landscape fractured into hundreds of tiny territories, each with its own laws, its own rulers, its own currencies. Travel between them meant crossing borders constantly. And those borders meant something important. They meant escape. If you committed a murder in one territory and crossed into another, you had effectively vanished. There was no centralized police force, no photographs, no fingerprints. Communication between jurisdictions was slow, unreliable, and often non-existent. A man who could move quickly and blend in could operate for years without anyone connecting his crimes. The roads themselves were dangerous, not metaphorically dangerous, physically, statistically dangerous. Merchants travelling with goods needed armed escorts. Isolated farmsteads could be raided with near-total impunity. Dense forests like the Spessart became synonymous with robbery and death. And the people who exploited this landscape weren't lone operators, they were organised. This is where the shepherds come in. In the 16th century, shepherds had a unique advantage. Their job required them to wander. A shepherd moving flocks across territories attracted no suspicion. People expected to see them on the roads, moving from pasture to pasture, village to village. They were invisible in plain sight. Peter Niers and his associates disguised themselves as shepherds. It was brilliant operational cover. They could travel openly, scout targets, and when the moment was right, transform from harmless wanderers into something else entirely. The gang structure was fluid rather than rigid. Sometimes as many as 24 members operated together for major raids. Other times, pairs or small groups would split off to work independently across different regions. This flexibility made them extremely difficult to track. When authorities in one territory began to piece together a pattern, the perpetrators had already moved on, perhaps operating under different names in a region whose officials had never heard of them. Now if you were a merchant or traveller in 1575, you had no way of knowing any of this organisational detail. All you knew was that people disappeared. All you knew was that certain stretches of road had acquired reputations. All you knew was that if you travelled without protection, you might not arrive. The fear was real even if the specific threat was often exaggerated, and that gap between real danger and perceived danger would become crucial to understanding what eventually happened to Peter Niers. Peter Niers didn't invent his methods. He learned them from a man named Martin Stier. Stier operated across German territories from the 1550s until his execution in 1572. He was, by the standards of his time, a master criminal, someone who had developed techniques for robbery, murder and evasion that worked consistently enough to keep him alive for decades. When authorities finally caught up with him, Stier had already trained a successor. That successor was Peter Niers. The relationship between Stier and Niers appears in multiple contemporary sources, suggesting it wasn't simply invented by later pamphlet writers. Niers genuinely apprenticed under Stier, learning what we might now call tradecraft, how to select victims, how to dispose of bodies, how to move across jurisdictions, how to avoid leaving witnesses. But Stier also reportedly taught Niers something else, something that would eventually transform his case from a straightforward criminal prosecution into something far stranger. According to contemporary accounts, Stier practiced black magic, and he passed these practices on to his apprentice. Now, whether Stier actually practiced any kind of magic is unknowable. What matters is that people believed he did, and once Niers was arrested, that belief would shape everything that followed. When Martin Stier was executed in 1572, Peter Niers had already been operating independently for some time. For the next 5 years, he would continue his work across Alsace, the Netherlands, and various German principalities. We know members of his network were eventually captured in at least 5 different locations: Landau, Kirchweiler am Rhein, Strasbourg, Pfalzburg, and Koblenz. That geographic spread tells us the scale of the operation. But in 1577, everything changed. Peter Niers was captured in Gersbach, a town in the Black Forest. The details of how authorities caught Niers in 1577 aren't recorded with precision. What we know is that they caught him, and they put him to torture, and he confessed. To understand what that means, to truly understand it, you need to understand the legal system of the time. In 16th century continental Europe, criminal justice operated under what historians call the inquisitorial system. This system had a fundamental premise borrowed from Roman law. Confession was considered the highest form of evidence. The Latin phrase was confessio est regina probationum. Confession is the queen of proofs. Without modern forensics, without DNA evidence, without surveillance cameras, how could you prove someone had committed a crime? Witnesses could be bribed or mistaken. Physical evidence could be ambiguous. But a confession, that was certainty, or so the theory went. The problem, of course, is that people will say almost anything to make pain stop. Medieval jurists actually recognized this problem. They weren't stupid. They understood that torture could produce false confessions. So they developed what they thought was a safeguard. A confession extracted under torture was only considered valid if the accused freely repeated it afterward, at a hearing held a day or two later, when torture was not being actively applied. Think about that for a moment. You've just been tortured. You've confessed to whatever your torturers wanted to hear. Now you're brought before a judge and asked to confirm your confession. If you recant, you know what happens. You go back to the torture chamber. The safeguard was meaningless. Everyone involved knew it was meaningless, but it provided legal cover, a procedural box that could be checked. Under this system, in 1577, Peter Niers confessed to 75 murders. 75 murders is an enormous number. Even accounting for years of operation, even accounting for gang activity, 75 victims represents a sustained campaign of killing that would make Niers one of the most prolific murderers of his era. The confession specified that most victims were women, possibly because women travelling alone were more vulnerable, possibly because the torturers specifically asked about female victims. Multiple crime pamphlets were published announcing the capture. These represent the earliest documented mentions of Peter Niers in the historical record. The printing press had been invented only about 120 years earlier, and by the 1570s, crime pamphlets had become a thriving genre. Cheap, sensational, and enormously popular. A pamphlet could be purchased for a halfpenny to a penny. For people who couldn't read, the pamphlets would be read aloud in public squares and taverns. The pamphlets transformed local crimes into shared cultural experiences, and Peter Niers, with his 75 confessed murders, was excellent material. But here's the thing. Peter Niers should have been executed in 1577. He wasn't. Somehow, between 1577 and 1581, Peter Niers escaped from custody. The historical record doesn't tell us how. What it tells us is far more interesting. It tells us how people at the time explained how. According to contemporary ballads and pamphlets, Niers possessed magical materials that granted him the power of invisibility. When authorities separated him from a sack containing these magical items, he lost his powers and could be recaptured. Now, in the 21st century, we might read that and dismiss it as superstition. But consider what it actually reveals. The authorities who captured Niers in 1577 were deeply concerned about his supposed magical abilities. They believed he possessed supernatural powers, and when he escaped, which he clearly did since he was arrested again 4 years later, They had to explain that escape in terms consistent with their worldview. The magical explanation wasn't embarrassment, it was theology. If Niers could escape from secure custody, that escape must have a supernatural cause. If he was later recaptured, that recapture must represent divine intervention. God had allowed the escape so that Nier could be caught again, so that his full crimes could be revealed, so that justice could be more completely served. This theological framing would become crucial to everything that followed. For 4 years, from 1577 to 1581, Peter Niers was free. What did he do during that time? If his later confession is accurate, he murdered 469 additional people, more than 117 per year, more than 2 per week, 1 every 3 days. If his later confession was extracted through torture from a man who had already become a legend, he might have done nothing of the kind. We simply don't know. And that uncertainty is the dark heart of this entire story. In August 1581, at an inn in Neumarkt in der Oberpfalz, someone recognised Peter Niers. The details of this recognition aren't recorded with certainty, but Neumarkt was a significant town, sitting on important trade routes, and word of the famous escaped murderer had clearly spread. Someone saw him, identified him, and reported him to authorities. This time, there would be no escape. The arrest happened quickly. Niers was taken into custody, and the torture began almost immediately, but this time, something was different. In 1577, Niers had confessed to 75 murders. Now, 4 years later, the torturers had specific expectations. The pamphlets had been circulating. The legend had grown. Peter Niers was no longer merely a murderer. He was becoming a monster, a symbol of everything that was dangerous and terrifying about life in 16th century Germany. And under torture, people tell their torturers what their torturers want to hear. The final confession of Peter Niers totaled 544 murders. Let me put that number in perspective. 4 years had passed since his first confession of 75 murders. For the new total to be accurate, Niers would have needed to kill an additional 469 people in approximately 1,460 days. That's 1 murder every 3 days, without exception, for 4 straight years. This is not physically impossible. Serial killers throughout history have maintained killing schedules, but 544 victims would make Niers one of the most prolific serial murderers in recorded human history, surpassing figures whose victim counts are well documented through multiple independent sources. And for Niers, we have exactly one source, his own confession, extracted under torture, in a legal system where torture routinely produced false admissions. Modern historians are unified in their skepticism. The jump from 75 to 544 murders has all the hallmarks of torture-induced confession inflation. Once Niers had confessed to some murders, once he had become famous for those murders, the pressure to confess to more, to match the legend that had grown up around him, would have been immense. But the number 544 wasn't the most disturbing element of the new confession. Among the charges levelled against Peter Niers in 1581 was this. He had murdered 24 pregnant women, cut the fetuses from their bodies, consumed their hearts, and used their hands for black magic rituals. This accusation needs to be understood in its cultural context because it wasn't random. It emerged from specific beliefs about magic, power, and the supernatural that were widespread in 16th century Europe. In the 1570s and 1580s, the great witch hunts were beginning to intensify across the continent. Educated clergy and magistrates were increasingly interpreting folk magic and popular supernatural beliefs through the lens of satanic conspiracy. The idea that certain people had made explicit pacts with the devil, trading their souls for supernatural powers, was moving from theological speculation to legal reality. Fetal remains occupied a particularly charged place in this belief system. In folk tradition, body parts from the unborn were thought to possess special magical properties. A murderer who was also a sorcerer, who had made a pact with the devil, would naturally seek out such materials. The accusations against Niers fit perfectly into this framework. Too perfectly. Here's what we know for certain. Peter Niers was accused of murdering pregnant women and using fetal remains in magic rituals. This accusation appears in the court records and the contemporary pamphlets. Here's what we don't know, whether he actually did any of this. There is no independent evidence, no archaeological remains, no witness testimonies from anyone who saw these crimes, no recovered materials. The accusation exists because Niers confessed to it under torture, and because the torturers asked him about it, and because the pamphlet writers repeated it. The timing is also suspicious. The fetal allegations are most prominent in the later pamphlets, particularly a Strasbourg pamphlet from 1583, 2 years after Niers was already dead. The narrative underwent progressive embellishment as it moved through print. This is a pattern that scholars who study early modern crime literature recognise well. The historian Joy Wiltenberg, who analysed over 200 printed crime accounts from this period, found that pamphlets routinely departed from actual judicial testimony, adding emotive language and sensational details to create emotional responses in readers. The pamphlets weren't journalism, they were entertainment with a moral purpose, designed to shock readers while reinforcing the authority of the state and the church, but entertainment nonetheless. Peter Niers was sentenced to death by breaking on the wheel, to be carried out over 3 days. The court specified exactly how this was to proceed. Day 1. The flesh. The executioner began with pincers, metal instruments with 2 handles and sharp, flat gripping surfaces, heated until they glowed. Systematically, methodically, he used these pincers to tear strips of flesh from Peter Niers' body. Not from one area, but from his entire body: arms, legs, torso, back. This was not a quick process. The tearing was deliberate, designed to cause maximum pain while keeping the subject alive. Each strip of flesh represented a discrete act of torture, a separate wound to be inflicted and observed. After the flesh had been torn away, creating open wounds across the entire body, the executioner poured hot oil into those wounds. Think about that for a moment. Not onto the wounds, into them. Oil heated until it was near boiling, applied directly to exposed muscle and tissue. This was not execution. This was the first day of 3. Peter Niers was expected to survive this, to remain alive for what came next. Day 2. The feet. On the second day, the executioners focused their attention on Niers' feet. They coated them in hot oil, possibly the same oil from the previous day, possibly fresh, and then held them over burning coals. The feet contain an enormous concentration of nerve endings. The soles, in particular, are extraordinarily sensitive. What was done to Peter Niers on the second day was, in a very specific sense, designed to maximize pain relative to physical damage. The goal was suffering, not death. Hour after hour, his feet were roasted. The oil would have acted as a conductor, distributing heat evenly across the skin, then the tissue beneath, eventually reaching bone. By the end of the second day, Peter Niers would have been unable to walk, unable to stand, his feet effectively destroyed. And still he lived. The third day awaited. You might ask, why 3 days? Why not simply execute him quickly? The answer lies in the logic of early modern punishment. The duration was the point. Extended suffering was understood to communicate the magnitude of the crime. A man who had murdered hundreds, or who was believed to have murdered hundreds, deserved not merely death, but a death that matched his transgressions. The 3-day structure allowed the community to witness, to process, to absorb the spectacle. People travelled from surrounding regions to watch. Neumarkt was not a large city, but the fame of Peter Niers ensured an audience. Executions were public events, part entertainment and part moral instruction. The suffering criminal was a text to be read, a message from state and church about the consequences of transgression. Day 3. The wheel. The breaking wheel was one of the most feared instruments of execution in European history. Used from antiquity through the 19th century, it wasn't abolished in Germany until 1827. The wheel represented the intersection of prolonged suffering and public spectacle. The procedure worked like this. Peter Niers was tied face up and naked to raised wooden stakes that elevated his limbs a few inches off the ground. His arms were stretched out, his legs extended. He was completely immobilized, completely exposed. The executioner then lifted a large iron-rimmed wagon wheel, heavy, solid, capable of crushing bone, and brought it down on Niers' body. The court had specified 42 strikes. This number was not arbitrary. It represented judicial deliberation, a calculated assessment of how much punishment Niers deserved. The executioner would have been obligated to count carefully, to ensure that exactly 42 blows were delivered. Each strike was aimed at the limbs, the arms first, then the legs. The wheel would fall, or be swung, with enough force to shatter bone. The humerus, the radius and ulna, the femur, the tibia and fibula, blow after blow, systematically working from hands to shoulders, from feet to hips. 42 strikes, 42 separate fractures, 42 separate moments of bone splintering under iron. This process took approximately 1 hour. After the wheel, Peter Niers was still alive. His limbs were destroyed, but his core organs remained intact. And so the execution proceeded to its final phase. Quartering. The executioner took a saw and dismembered Niers while he still breathed. Arms were cut from shoulders, legs were cut from hips. Whether Niers remained conscious throughout this process is unknown, but the historical record suggests that he was alive when it began. Only when the dismemberment was complete did Peter Niers finally die. His remains, the pieces of what had once been a man, would likely have been displayed. Medieval and early modern authorities understood the criminal corpse as a political statement. Bodies were hung on wheels, heads were placed on spikes, limbs were scattered as warnings. What remained of Peter Niers probably served this purpose, left to rot and be consumed by carrion birds as a message to anyone who might consider following his path. Here's something that should give you pause. Peter Niers was not the only alleged mass murderer executed in German territories in 1581. That same year, according to contemporary pamphlets, a man named Christman Genipperteinga was executed for 964 murders committed between 1568 and 1581. Nearly 1,000 victims, supposedly. An even more spectacular criminal than Niers. There's just one problem. Modern scholars believe Genipperteinga may have been entirely fictional. The pamphlet accounts of his crimes are so sensational, so perfectly calibrated to contemporary fears, that historians suspect they were fabricated wholesale. No independent records confirm his existence. No court documents have been found. He exists only in the pamphlets, and pamphlets, as we've established, were entertainment as much as documentation. If Genipperteinga was fiction, what does that tell us about Niers? It doesn't mean Niers was fictional. We have more evidence for his existence. Multiple pamphlets from different times, references to his arrest in 1577, documentation of his execution in 1581. Peter Niers was real, but the Genipperteinga case demonstrates that the pamphlet industry was capable of inventing entire criminals from nothing. If writers could create a fictional murderer with 964 victims, they could certainly embellish the crimes of a real murderer whose first confession totaled 75. The number 544 starts to look very different in this context. Let me be clear about what the historical evidence actually supports. Peter Niers existed. He was arrested in 1577 and confessed under torture to 75 murders. He escaped custody through unknown means. He was recaptured in 1581 at an inn in Neumarkt. He was tortured extensively and confessed to 544 murders, including allegations of black magic and fetal cannibalism. He was executed over 3 days through a combination of pincers, hot oil, roasting, breaking on the wheel, and quartering. All of that is documented. What is not documented, what cannot be verified, is whether he actually committed 544 murders, or 75, or any specific number. We know he confessed. We know the confessions were extracted through torture. We know that torture routinely produced false confessions in this period, a fact that contemporary observers themselves acknowledged. One 16th century writer who had experience with interrogation noted the fundamental paradox of the system. Even innocent people, overcome by the intensity of pain, would acknowledge crimes they had never committed, while guilty people with high pain tolerance could withstand torture and maintain their innocence. The system selected for pain sensitivity, not for guilt. Peter Niers may have been a prolific serial killer. He may have been a bandit who committed dozens of murders. He may have been a relatively ordinary criminal whose legend grew beyond all proportion to his actual crimes. We cannot know. What we can know is this. Peter Niers became a legend because of the printing press. The technology was barely a century old in 1581, but it had already transformed how people understood crime. Before print, knowledge of criminals was local. A murderer might terrorize one region while remaining completely unknown in the next territory. Stories spread through word of mouth, distorting with each retelling. Print changed everything. A pamphlet printed in Strasbourg could be read in Nuremberg within weeks. A criminal's name could become famous across the entire German-speaking world. And once a name became famous, it attracted stories that might or might not be true. The scholar Joy Wiltenberg, who has studied early modern crime literature extensively, found that these pamphlets didn't simply document crime. They shaped how people understood crime. They created emotional responses, promoted identification with victims, and reinforced the authority of the state. They were propaganda as much as information. In this context, Peter Niers wasn't just a criminal. He was content. He was a story that sold pamphlets, that drew crowds to executions, that gave people something to talk about in taverns. The worse his crimes, the better the story. The more supernatural his powers, the more compelling the narrative. Did pamphlet writers consciously exaggerate his crimes? Did torturers ask leading questions based on what they'd read in pamphlets, then receive confessions that confirmed their expectations? Did the legend of Peter Niers grow because growth was profitable, because sensation sold, because a man who killed 75 people was less interesting than a man who killed 544? Almost certainly yes to all of those questions. Peter Niers emerged during a specific historical moment, a moment of crisis that helps explain both his crimes and his legend. The 1570s and 1580s were hard years in German territories. Harvest failed repeatedly, partly due to climate shifts associated with what historians call the Little Ice Age. Wages stagnated while prices rose. The gap between rich and poor widened. Armies marched across the landscape, leaving deserters in their wake, men with military training and no legitimate employment. Banditry flourished because the conditions for banditry were ideal. Desperate people turned to crime. Forests and mountains provided cover. Fragmented political authority made pursuit difficult. The problem was real, and authorities struggled to address it. But the representation of banditry in crime literature was substantially more terrifying than the actual threat. Pamphlets depicted murderous robber bands as superhuman threats, as agents of chaos, as embodiments of everything that had gone wrong in the social order. The criminals in these pamphlets weren't just criminals, they were monsters. Peter Niers fit perfectly into this template. A bandit leader operating across multiple territories, a man associated with black magic and the supernatural, a murderer of extraordinary prolificacy. He was exactly what the pamphlet reading public feared, exactly what they expected to find lurking in the forests and on the roads. The irony is that by creating such perfect monsters, the pamphlets may have made the real problem harder to address. When every criminal became a legendary figure, when every execution became a spectacle, the ordinary work of maintaining order, the difficult, unglamorous task of investigation and prosecution, became secondary to the performance of justice. Peter Niers' 3-day execution was a performance. It communicated power, morality, divine justice. But it didn't prevent future crime. It didn't address the economic conditions that produced bandits. It didn't fix the fragmented political system that made pursuit so difficult. It was theatre. Extraordinarily violent theatre, but theatre nonetheless. For 3 days in September 1581, Peter Niers suffered. That suffering was witnessed by crowds. It was documented in records. It was celebrated in pamphlets. What did it accomplish? If you believe the worldview of the 16th century, it accomplished a great deal. The suffering was payment for sin. The public nature of the suffering served as deterrent and instruction. The systematic destruction of the criminal's body demonstrated the power of legitimate authority over those who challenged it. The ultimate death, after sufficient torment, restored cosmic balance. If you don't believe that worldview, if you approach the execution from a modern perspective, the question becomes more uncomfortable. Peter Niers may have been a serial killer who genuinely deserved punishment. He may have been a relatively ordinary criminal whose crimes were inflated beyond recognition by torture and sensationalism. We cannot know which, and yet the same punishment was applied regardless. The torture extracted confessions. But torture extracts confessions whether the subject is guilty or innocent. The spectacle communicated power. But spectacle communicates power whether justice is being served or not. The pamphlets spread his story, but pamphlets spread stories regardless of their truth. The system that killed Peter Niers was designed to produce certainty, the certainty of confession, the certainty of punishment, the certainty of justice. But it was a system built on unreliable foundations, capable of destroying both the guilty and the innocent with equal thoroughness. Peter Niers died on September 16, 1581, dismembered alive after 3 days of torture. His remains were displayed as a warning. His story continued to circulate in pamphlets for years, decades, eventually centuries. He became a figure of folklore, a boogeyman invoked to frighten children, a symbol of evil that lurked in the dark forests and on the dangerous roads. The historical Peter Niers, whoever he actually was, disappeared beneath layers of legend. We know he existed. We know he was a criminal. We know how he died, in excruciating detail. We don't know how many people he killed. We don't know if he practiced magic. We don't know if the Fetal accusations had any basis in reality. We don't know if he was the monster the pamphlets described or something smaller, something more ordinary, something that the sensationalist machinery of early modern print transformed into legend. What we know is that a man was tortured for 3 days and killed while crowds watched. What we know is that his confession was extracted through pain, not investigation. What we know is that his story was repeated and embellished until the truth became unreachable. The printing press that created Peter Niers' legend would create many more, and 2 years after his death, the most elaborate pamphlet about him would be published in Strasbourg, adding details, embellishing crimes, cementing his place in history as one of the most notorious killers Germany had ever produced. But the same press that spread his story also spread something else. The witch trials were intensifying, and the techniques used to extract Niers' confession, the torture, the leading questions, the assumptions about satanic conspiracy would be applied to thousands of others in the decades to come.